Hey, Josh from Bernal Cutlery, and wanted to show you a little bit about single bevel sharpening today. So just to clarify real quick, my apologies if this is redundant, you already know it, but I think there's a tiny bit of confusion sometimes about what single bevel is. There are knives that are sharpened all right-handed, and they are right-handed knives, and they're not single bevel. They can be left-handed too, such as this Honeski Kaku. This one is essentially a right-handed knife. It's got lots of convexity on the outside. Most of the sharpening is done on the outside, and there's a little sharpening done on the inside. However, this will always be a double bevel knife, no matter how right-handed you make it, in that it does not have a concave inside. And the angle on this side of the bevel, the inside bevel, is angled out a little bit. So double bevel. Single bevel is also a right or left-handed knife. This is a right-handed one. This has got a wide bevel, the kiriba, out on the outside here. The inside, the ura, is hollow ground, and then the Urasaki bevel is put flat over that. So a little bit of a different anatomy to a single bevel knife. You can't make a double bevel knife single bevel. You can make it very, very right-handed or left-handed, but anyhow, enough of that. Let's sharpen. So I'm going to be showing you more of the technique and less of like all of the stages of each stone that you could go through with a single bevel knife. Now, for a lot of people, the single bevel knife that they start sharpening on will be a newish single bevel knife. And one thing that I think is important to know is that the kiriba on most new single bevel knives, even really super high quality ones, will not be dead flat. It's not going to be perfectly even with the surface of your stone. The way that these are finished at the workshops, in order to, not have an extra $100 added to the price of the knife at least, is to finish this with machines. There's a lot of handwork that's involved with it, but very, very rarely is a knife getting hand finished before it's delivered. So you as the sharpener will be doing that work, and one thing to note is that you'll probably be finding a couple little dimples in the kiriba as you start working. More likely than not, some coarse scratches as well. So over time, you'll work those out. But let's get sharpening. All right, so I have some stones soaking here, and today I'm going to be working with the Takara Zakushi 1200 stone, the Naniwa Pro 2000, and Jinko Auto. This goes about 2,000 to 4,000. We'll also have a couple fine stones as well, and this is a little box that we make. This super simple stone bridge that goes over this half pan, and you could use whatever setup you like. Just have the level of the stone about the level of your belly button while you're sharpening. This is a stone holder. These are great if your stones are not on a wooden die. This is one that we've glued onto a repurposed wooden die. This was on an old 6000 stone, and we've used it quite a few times. Use a wood that won't rot or warp. So 2x4s aren't going to be so great, but cedar, cypress, ipe, those are some woods that are warp and rot resistant. And glue the stone down with slower curing epoxy. There's marine epoxies that are like pastes, or if you use like a kind of more standard 2-part epoxy, pick one that has a longer cure time. So I'm going to sharpen a Yanagi today. Hitohira Kikochiyo Manzo, Aogami 2, and like we were mentioning before, typically new knives are not going to have a completely homogeneous flat kiriba, this main bevel, and as you sharpen it, you're going to be smoothing that out and kind of getting it nice and flat, and that doesn't have to happen all at once. You can do that if you like. I've worked on this knife a little bit with the 500 stone before we got started right now, but it still isn't completely flat. There's a couple little low spots that are remaining, to be expected. That's just the way it is with new knives. There's a couple deeper scratches from the grinding Again, that's okay. It's not going to impede the function of the knife. How much time you want to spend prepping with a core stone is up to you when you have a new knife. Some people reason that they don't want to do much work here, so they're going to do all their fine sharpening on the Abra side, and that's a mistake. So we don't want to overdo this side. We're going to work on this side a bit, but we're going to start with focusing on the outside. Got the outside and inside, or omote and Abra. Before we start sharpening, we're going to use our flattener to raise a little bit of slurry. This stone definitely is a little bit faster cutting when it has a little bit of mud on it. I've flattened the stone already, so the purpose of this is to just raise a little bit of mud. So you can see a little slurry starting to form. And this really helps speed up the cutting ability of this stone and many others. If your stone is semi-hard, if it doesn't yield mud real quickly, then doing this to get started will really help your stone cut faster. Ceramic stones that don't have a secondary binder in them, the mud from it won't reharden on your flattening stone. But for many stones that use some type of binder, that can reharden on your flattener. So remove the mud that was left on there from your flattening. So we're going to be working with the angle of approach a little bit closer to a 90-degree angle than the 45 that we would do a double bevel at. And the reason for this is that many single bevel knives have a different pitch to the angle of the kiriba along the length of the blade. So typically the heel is a chunkier angle than the tip, so it'll kind of taper out like this. Debas have that a lot. Yanagis do as well. So we want to preserve that as well. So to start with, we're going to be putting a little bit of pressure over this boundary line. My thumb is going to come in here and put a little bit of gentle pressure down. My forefinger's coming down and putting even less pressure. So it's not a ton of pressure, but just enough to keep a nice consistent contact point here. The purpose of this finger coming up on the spine is to keep the knife from flopping up. But I'm not going to be overdoing it. I don't want to push too hard with my forefinger. Secondary fingers are coming down about in the middle of the blade over where the shinogi line, the boundary between the kiriba and the face is. And that will be to emphasize work in that top zone. Right now, I'm working on more of the iron section of the kiriba than the steel section. So you can see the contrast between the two parts of the blade here. We have an iron backing with a steel cutting edge. And so these feel a lot different when you're sharpening them. The iron has a much stickier feel to it, and the steel has a harder, more slidey feel. So as I'm working, I do a couple of strokes and then move the handle a little bit away, but I'm always keeping these secondary hand fingers over the center of the stone. We don't want to let these fingers go over the end because there's a little guillotine that forms there, and we don't want to guillotine our finger. Not the purpose. So you'll notice I have a sponge in the bath, and the purpose of this sponge is to clean off the blade while I'm working. And if I need to dry the blade, I'll use my towel. But avoid getting the grit from this onto your towel while you're working. So let's take a look here real quick. So we've quickly worked up the blade here, and we're mostly working in this top zone here where the iron is. Purpose of working that area, it's farthest away from the edge. The purpose of that is to preserve the geometry of the knife. I should back up here a sec and mention that before you get started, you should always check for the straightness. This is really important. So sight your knife, take a look at it this way, line it up, see if it's got a curve to it. If it's bending off to one side, that can be remedied. And another way to check for the straightness is to line up the edge and the spine this way. So you're going to kind of Move the knife till you see the edge line up with the spine. We don't want to see any twisting in the knife. A little bit of a bend, that'll happen over time. So typically single bevel knives, if you let this knife sit for 10 years and pick it back up and look at it, you will see that it will have bent this way a little bit. And it can be bent back to a straight thing. If it is twisted though, if this is wobbly like this, if it's got a wave in the edge, that's not really something that's that easy to fix. So check your knives for that before you purchase them. Okay, so our stone should have a nice soak in it such that it stays hydrated while we're working. It might be that we need to add a little bit of water to keep this mud moving nice and smoothly. Don't overdo it. The other great thing about a sponge is that you could add just 1 or 2 drops of water. So quite often, very little is enough. So let's keep going. We initially started over the top of the Kiriba here at the shinogi line. That's the boundary between this big wide bevel and the face. Now, it should be emphasized that there's light pressure being put down on the blade. The stone does the work with the knife traveling over it. We don't need to mash the knife into the stone. That will actually go counter to our purpose. So that can slow the stone down by loading up its surface with metal, and it can also make us work a lot less safely and effectively. So very little pressure is needed. The point of the pressure coming down from our fingers of our secondary hand onto the blade is to emphasize the point of contact. So by having my fingers here in the middle, I'm emphasizing the grinding happening about in the middle. If I were to move my fingers closer to the edge over the steel, which I'll do next, then we'll emphasize the grinding on that part. And again, the point of stepping down where we're emphasizing on the Kiriba as we go is to maintain the original geometry that was ground into the knife. We want to preserve that. If this is the first couple times that you've been sharpening your knife, you're going to see a lot of things that are going to look like imperfections. Chances are you'll see an oval in this zone of the blade where you're not getting any work done. And provided that that oval doesn't extend to the end of the Kiriba at the edge, it's okay, and it's kind of to be expected that there's going to be 1 or 2 dimples in this. The way that these are ground from the workshop is typically on a big 3-foot kaiten toishi, and that will leave little pockets as the blade goes over a big, large, round wheel. It will not make a perfectly flat bevel. So we're going to be working towards that, but if you have little scratches, little hollows in there, your knife is still going to work. You can still use it. Don't get caught up on that. Don't feel like you have to spend hours and hours and hours grinding all those things out before you work. Sometimes perfect is the opposite of the good. There are a lot of aesthetic concerns that can be taken into account when doing single bevel knives, but aesthetics are something that shouldn't stop you from feeling like you can go ahead and use your knife. So a lot of respect to people that get really amazing finishes on their bevels here. You don't have to get out 100% of the previous scratches in order to have a knife that's going to work beautifully for cutting sashimi, which is this knife's essentially its sole job. So I'm going to work now over the steel part of the Kiriba. I had been working over the iron. You might notice a different sound here. This is a different feeling material to sharpen. So this hard steel slides a little bit more. And this is where you really notice different smiths' heat treatments. So this is a super easy, buttery feeling aogami. It is also not uncommon to find aogamis that are a little more slippery and, maybe a little glassy feeling. And this is where quite often you get really rewarded for having a knife that's higher quality. So this is where the benefits really come in, I feel, to stepping up the quality of the forging on a knife. This steel is a lot easier to sharpen than a lot of less expensive knives. And this isn't a terribly expensive knife, but this is definitely like top tier Sakai knife making here. And this Monton is kind of a mark of the skill of the smith here. If you see any little tiny gaps, little dark marks in this cladding back here, that's not necessarily a flaw. That can show that the smith that made your knife had a really good temperature control and didn't overheat the steel when they were forge welding the iron and the steel. So now I've worked the entire face. If I had a spot that I wanted to work more in, so let's say I had a hollow right in here, instead of working right over the hollow, the low spot, I would want to work on its neighboring high spots. Same thing if you have a chip in the edge. So the concept here, and we'll make a chip with we're not going to really chip the knife, but let's say this little mark, make it bigger. Oh Lord, that would be a nightmare if you had that on your Yanagi. But let's say, for illustration's sake here, that this is a chip. Rather than sharpening straight over that chip, what we're going to do is sharpen in the two areas next to it to bring the level of the edge down to it. So, being that I have this spot here with a chip on it, I'm going to start next to it. And we'd be working for a while, but then we're going to skip up to the area ahead of it and then blend that work together. It would be quite a bit of work to take out that chip. We would also be working on the edge itself. But just to give you an idea, if instead of a chip, you had a low spot in this area, again, super common to see a little dimple form here once you start sharpening it. And that's coming from the workshop where it was ground at. You would be working here and here to work out a dimple right there. So we have a dead flat kiriba that goes all the way to the edge. So this, we have one angle right now. And that if we should finish that out and cut with an edge like this, for the first few cuts, it would feel amazingly sharp, and then we would have tons of little chips on the edge from where we hit the cutting board, even if we had great knife skills and a good quality cutting board. And that's because a flat bevel that just terminates without a second bevel is very brittle. So we're going to put in a micro bevel or itoba now. So up to this point, we've been working just right on the angle of the big wide bevel. Now we're going to tip it up quite a bit. So I'm tipping this about 25 degrees, maybe 30 degrees, and that might seem especially high, but if you think that you might work with the combined angle on a chef's knife or a slicer, etc., of 30 degrees, of 15 degrees on each side, then by putting in one 30 degree, we're getting that same angle. So very little grinding has gone in. I'm going to do a little more of this. This is a micro bevel, so the purpose of this is to support the edge. We're not really getting too much into the geometry of this big wide bevel here, so we're preserving that, but we're going to toughen up that edge a lot by doing that. So that's really crucial. Next, we need to look at the ura. So, like I said, I took this knife to a 500 stone from its factory edge, and so in the process of removing bit of metal on the big wide primary, I removed most of the flat urasaki, and we can see on the tip here where it's polished how that kind of starts to loop around, and we want this to continue all the way down the edge here. So it's super important that we have a dead flat bevel going over this hollow bevel. So remember, this is concave, it's not flat. I need to flatten this stone before I do that. So even though I don't think that this stone has gone out of true with the small amount of work that I've done, okay, so now we have a nice flat stone. We're not going to have any high spots on the edge to dig in to this ura. So we're keeping the knife in the same hand, so we're not switching hands. And again, about a 90-degree angle of approach. And put more pressure towards the edge than the back. Our thumb here is going to just keep the knife from flipping up, and it's not going to be pushing down. We have quite a bit of iron through most of the spine of this knife, and that iron will grind a lot quicker than the steel, and we don't want to overdo the spine. Because I had removed most of the ura bevel, I'm using this 1200 stone. However, I would caution against going to a coarser stone on this ura too often. Some people will just do their honing on the ura, reasoning that if they get a really nice looking surface on the omote here, on the kiriba, that they don't want to mess it up. So they're just going to hone on this side with a fine stone. And you can do that a couple times before you need to work on this again. But we really want to make sure that this stays concave and does not get flattened out. If we flatten this out and remove the concavity on this side, then this knife becomes very sticky and pulls at what we're cutting, and that is the opposite of what we want. So we laid in a little bit of ura, and I'm not going to overdo it. So now I want to remove this stone, and we're going to get our 2000 to start. This is a harder stone than this ceramic, and I like hard stones for doing uras. I think it's important to kind of focus on them. But this 1200 is a fast cutting stone, and I needed to get a little bit of metal off of this edge here to provide a platform for this edge. By polishing this, I will be able to create a much better platform for this edge. If I leave in these marks here, not only will the edge be brittle because it's much thinner, but the edge will only be as fine as the grind on this side is, with these little grinds coming to the edge. So we need to get them out. Again, just some pressure behind the edge, and just enough pressure to make sure that the knife and stone contact in a very intentional spot. We don't want to overdo this. The job of this stone is just to remove the scratches from the previous one, and so I don't want to overdo it. I will be using some more stones. It is real important, though, that this ura is nice and even. If your knife shows a bunch of dips in and out where the ura contacts and then doesn't, then that can be an issue with the straightness of the knife. It can be an issue with some torsion or twisting. You know, if you're really stuck and you don't want to overdo if you don't want to overdo a whole bunch of sections to get into one area, if you can't fix it by straightening it, then you can, and this is kind of cheating, but it works, you can use the corner of the stone to set in your ura as well. So, last ditch. Also make sure that you get nice contact up to the point here. Sometimes this just needs a little extra work at the tip. Again, we don't want to overdo it, but we want to get those scratches out from that previous stone. I like to polish the ura bevel just a little bit more than the outside bevel. And depending on the type of knife you're sharpening and what kind of job it has, you will be going to different degrees of fineness. A sashimi knife like this works really well at a really fine finish, as does an usuba, of the Japanese vegetable knife that's a single bevel knife. A deba, which is meant for breaking down fish, needs a much coarser outside edge in order to make its way through fish skin and bones and whatnot. So we could continue either with this Naniwa Hard 2000. This is a very homogeneous stone. The finish that it gives looks finer than 2000. We could also go to our Jinko Alto. This one starts out a little bit coarser than this one, so I'm going to go ahead and use this one. And this is kind of one or the other. You don't need to have a million stones for single bevel, but you can't jump the same as you can with double bevel. Double bevel, you can jump from a 1,000 to a 6,000, say, and that will do fine. However, with single bevel, we need an intermediary stone to help remove the coarser scratches. So I'm going to go ahead and use this one. We'll just kind of recap our technique. I'm not going to take you through the whole polishing process, but a good thing to keep in mind as you're moving up through your grits and what to think about for setting yourself up for sharpening with single bevel knives is that you almost need to double your grit. So if you're starting with 1,000 in order to remove the scratches from that 1,000, effectively get something that's roughly twice as fine. So that would be like 2,000 to 3,000 from 1,000. And 800, 1,200, 1,000, they're all very analogous, so you can kind of treat them the same more or less. Individual stones will have different characteristics. So this 1,200 stone cuts very deeply. It almost cuts like many 800 stones. So getting to know your stones, can also help you choose which is going to be a nice stone to work with. This to me looks like it's not flat. You see how this is pulling up some mud in just one small area? And when I look at the work here, I'm going to see, and I don't know if it's, if you can pick it up here on the camera or not, but it just looks like it's working a little bit more here than the rest of the part I was sharpening. So that is an indication that I need to flatten this stone. So real important, that's why we need flat stones for single bevel. It's much more crucial with single bevel than double bevel, but also important for double bevel. This is a very soft and muddy stone. And so you can see right away we've pulled up a lot of mud. And I really like the mud on this stone for another purpose. And that is, so again, remove the mud from your flattener, don't let it dry on there. I like to make these little polishing pads with a little piece of cotton rolled up, and we're going to swab up this mud that we've generated through flattening, and this is going to be our extra fine rust eraser. So down the line, if we should leave our knife wet and need to remove some rust, then we can do so. So let's say I got a little rusty spot on the blade here. I would add some water to my little polishing pad here and work out the rust like this. Always put the knife down on a stone when you do this. Do not hold a knife like this. You can really gnarl your hand. Do not do that. But putting it flat down like this makes a great platform to clean off of, and it's going to scratch very lightly, so it's going to give a lighter scratch than the grit from the stone would. So before you throw that away, before you rinse it off, go ahead and swab a little bit of it up. It's not really going to be useful for making polishes on knives so much. It scratches so lightly that it's not super effective, but great for cleaning without scratching. So now the job of this stone is to remove the scratches that were laid on with the 1200 before. And this stone starts out a bit more aggressive, starts out like a 2000, and the more that we use it and let the slurry get broken up, the finer it will become. So I especially like this one for that kind of work. This stone will really let you know if you're pushing too hard in that you will get a glazed surface. You'll get some metal packed in to the face of the stone. Be sure to soak this one. This one likes a good long soak. It needs to be fully hydrated to really work at its peak. If, however, you don't have the time to really hydrate this one, then you'll need to start adding water as you go. But be aware that with more water and pressure, this one cuts more aggressively, like many natural stones. So this is called a man-made auto, and auto stones are, blue stones are a naturally occurring stone that's been used for many hundreds of years in Japan for this purpose right here. This is roughly 2,000 to 4,000, I'd say, and with a lot of water and pressure, it's closer to 2. Now I'm going to move my fingers closer to the edge. But as you keep using it, if you pull up on your pressure, lighten up a little bit, and just use the spent mud, it becomes a little bit finer. This is a great edge for debas, for butchery knives, for something that you want to have a lot of bite with. This is a great one. It also is very useful for working up. So essentially the job of this stone is to remove the scratches from the last stone, and provided I remove the bulk of those scratches, I'll get a nice finish. If I'm in a hurry, I could jump up to my fine stone now. If I'm not in a hurry, I could keep working. You don't have to spend hours and hours and hours, and if you see when the knife is new, a couple little stray scratches come in this way, or a little dimple. Right now I have a little dimple at the shinogi here. So I'd like to work that out, but I'm not going to have time shooting this video. I would be holding you hostage here for quite a while. My aim will be to do that. And, if this is my knife, I'm going to be working with, my own cooking, then I will know that I'm going to keep sharpening this, and I will work out that little dimple with time. If this was a customer's knife and they wanted me to remove that, then of course we would want to do that. But that also takes, time and adds expense. So there's times when we're not looking for a flawless finish to get a really good working knife. A flawless finish takes a lot of skill. It's really gorgeous. But again, it is not totally essential for this knife to perform at its best. So keep that in mind. If while you're starting out, you feel like your work is subpar, chances are being a little too critical of yourself. So I'm trying to get up all the mud that's up on this. And this is, don't forget the micro bevel. So we don't want to leave that really rough. But we'll keep going with different finer grits. And hopefully this helps you get an idea for how to sharpen single bevel knives. In a way, they're a little bit easier than double bevel in that you don't have to do as much guessing. But I think there's a couple important things to keep in mind while you're working. I hope that this video has helped you get a better understanding of it. And if you've made it this far with me on this journey, then I'm assuming it was interesting. But if not, try another one of our videos. And we'll be posting a lot more sharpening. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.